everybody, and welcome back to Psychedelics. Today, this is Joe Moore. I'm joined by Seth Rosenberg of District Psychedelic. Actually, is that the organization, Seth?
District Psychedelic is just really my website, and it's sort of the moniker I've used going forward in the psychedelic world.
I love it. I kind of didn't realize how cool it sounded until this morning.
Thank you.
Yeah, you got it. Nice work. And so you were. Well, I guess let's rewind the tape. How did you first kind of like encounter and get interested in this psychedelic space to somewhat serious degree, to the point where you became a pretty substantial activist? We'll start there, and we'll get into the details later.
Sure. I have been interested since forever, and it's very funny. In thinking back on my high school experience, where I was a D and F student and then started taking psychedelics and then became an A student, I wouldn't have equated the two as connected at the time. But my initial love of psychedelics started when I was too young to be using them in the 80s. I was punk rock, but knew a lot of the Deadheads and got into that. And then, buying into all of the science of the time, I stopped using psychedelics in my early 20s and didn't really come back to them until much later in life. I'm 52 now, and I started getting back involved when I was, in my early 40s, around 40, I started getting into mycology. And I became a very avid amateur mycologist, and as part of that, joined the Washington Mycological Association, the Mycological Association of Washington, D.C., which is a fantastic organization not associated with psychedelics. Don't go there for psychedelics, but if you love mycology.
Yeah, mycologists are not that interested in psychedelics, turns out.
Right.
So they actually kind of get really awkward when you start talking about it. But yeah,
well,
like
they will talk
Metro
about it. They will talk about it very freely, and there are lots of presentations, but they're not going to help you find them. It's not going to. There's no one wants to get asked.
The mushroom hunting thing is, they're not going to teach you how to mushroom hunt and take you on forages and all that. Yeah, totally.
Early on, I think I don't remember. When they were still doing some of the very first stuff, Albert Garcia Romu came and spoke to the Mycological Association about the research that they were doing in psilocybin. And
he's attached to Hopkins.
He is one of the big. He's a Hopkins researcher and was associated with the at that time the smoking cessation study. Mm-hmm. And I listened to what he was saying, and I was blown away. I thought it was just. I mean, I was already a mycophile, so I was already very familiar with, all of the amazing, structure of mushrooms and all of that stuff. But then to add in the fact that psychedelics may actually be helping people to quit smoking and to deal with addiction and all of this other stuff, and that maybe it didn't give you brain damage and everything you'd heard in high school was not really accurate. And from that point on, I got very involved with the research. And contacted a number of different researchers. And, if people don't know, scientists out there are usually really happy to talk about their work if you contact them respectfully. So I started getting very involved with that. And I had surgery on my foot, and I had to sit around for 6 months and started looking up all this other stuff and discovered MAPS and CIIS. And then I learned that just happened to be when DC was starting to do I-81. And I went to their first meeting and asked to sign on to be their press secretary. So, and that's when I became very publicly psychedelic.
So who was behind I-81? Is that a Decriminalized Nature thing?
I-81 was Decriminalized Nature, and Melissa Lavasani was the person who started that petition. And, to be very clear, I started with I-81 in the beginning, and when COVID hit, I dropped out. And the amazing work that was done on I-81 to drive through that petition during COVID is something I admire tremendously. I cannot take any credit for. That was other people who braved going out pre-vaccine to get those signatures. I was with them in the very first couple of months.
Right on.
Um,
Cool. And you reached out to me. This is a good transition. In regards to the Colton podcast we did, Cole was the first person in Denver to have a really public psilocybin bust post Denver decriminalizing, and it was by the feds actually, which everybody thought, oh, the feds wouldn't do that. That's small, but the feds came in to prove a point. But what was it about that episode that made you want to reach out? Like, you have a personal connection to this kind of thing.
um, well, I had been in touch with Cole previously. He actually mentioned me
Oh,
in
good.
passing in the podcast, as he had mentioned some guy in Washington, D.C. who he had spoken to.
Mm-hmm.
That was me. Um, and what what struck me about Cole's story is that regardless of my support for him, and I have complete support for him, it is a story that can easily be dismissed. Oh, the guy was breaking the rules. He was selling drugs. What are you going to do? You know? And I know people in the psychedelic community who have that opinion. I mean, it's difficult for some people to remember that it is the people who have gotten busted that have gotten us here every bit as much as the people who've done the activism. And I felt that there is an awful lot that was left out as far as a cautionary tale, and I wanted to share the story of my arrest, which was very different from Cole's. And I never sold drugs. I was an activist, and as I mentioned, I dropped out of I-81 around March of whatever it was, 2020, whenever the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna get my years mixed up. It's like one long pandemic. And then I mostly did activism work. And at that particular moment in time, I was fortunate enough to be making a lot of money in the stock market. So I wasn't really too worried about things. And I was participating in talking to people in the psychedelic stock market that had really just opened up. And I was teaching people to grow mushrooms online.
Mm.
And I was pretty vocal about getting involved with I-81. Like I said, I wasn't part of the campaign at that point. And I did quite a bit of posting photographs
Mm-hmm.
and was, uh, I would say, arrogant is probably the word I'd use
Mm.
in my confidence that I was untouchable. I mean, if that doesn't just scream white privilege, I don't know what does. But there we are. Um, so I'm, in addition to being a mycologist, I'm a bit of an expert in entheological plants, and I collect quite a few of them and I grow them. I do want to make clear that I am not a psychonaut. I am not someone who takes tons of psychedelics and will try everything. I use psychedelics incredibly sparingly, but I
Mm-hmm.
think their benefits are worth my time, and my work. But in growing my plants and in collecting entheogens from around the world, I had ordered some plants online. I ordered off of a website on the clear web. I used a credit card. The plants that I ordered are not illegal. At that moment in time, I was a member of a religious organization and had been attending services that were sincere in their intent and were a psychedelic institution. Um, anyway, when I ordered these plants, rather than go and buy plants from Home Depot, which I could have done, it is my preference to send my money to smaller organizations, and I ordered my plants from abroad. This was in February of 2020. COVID hit
Mm.
and mail stopped, and I forgot all about it. And then in like December, I get an email saying, okay, it's coming. I'm like, great. And then I forget all about it. January 13th, 2021, I go and I pick up my daughter from her mom's house. I come home at 10 o'clock in the morning. I get a knock on my door at 11 in the morning. There's a DHL package. I say, oh, great. I've been waiting for this. And I go and I open it up, and it's full of plastic beads. And I'm totally confused. And I'm checking my email to go call them. This legal order on a credit card on the clear web of legal plants. And all of a sudden, there's the bang on the door, and I open it, and 11 SWAT agents bust in. I had been in the middle of making lunch for my 8.5-year-old daughter and my 72-year-old mother at the time. We were standing there doing absolutely nothing, and 11 agents from 5 different agencies showed up with machine guns into my home. They handcuffed me. They forced my mother and my daughter to sit on the couch and did not allow them to make any phone calls while they ransacked my room. And then I got dragged out and stuck in, excuse me for a second.
Mm-hmm.
I got basically stuck in solitary confinement for about 40 hours because
Oh my God.
of COVID.
Mm-hmm.
You know, nobody could share a cell. And then I was initially charged with federal conspiracy charges. I'm going to be vague about anything more than that.
Mm-hmm.
But 2 different federal conspiracy charges for substances I did not have and have never seen. And by the time I got out of jail the next day, my charges had been switched to a DC case from a federal case, and it was changed to possession with intent to distribute peyote. One of the plants I had ordered was San Pedro cactus. And, you know, the Michael Palin book just came out recently where he talks about using the San Pedro cactus. He has a cautionary, I don't know if you've read it, but he has a cautionary tale about somebody in sort of my situation with opium, but then has a very explicit section about the San Pedro cactus, which is legal. The only cactus that is written into the law is Lophophora williamsi and the peyotes. It is very specific. There are no other cacti. And
Is this like municipal district laws, or is this
this is in
like
the federal laws.
federal? Okay.
I'm sure municipal districts someplace have laws, but I have never seen in all of the research I did any laws that pertain specifically to, you know, that would actually encompass any of the San Pedro cacti. And the reason that they don't do that is because if they did, they'd have to shut down Home Depot and Lowe's. About 20% of all column cactus contain mescaline. All of them, the ones in your yard, the ones at the courthouse, they all contain mescaline. Not all of them, but there's an amazing resource called Trout's Notes. I don't have the link handy, but it is the most comprehensive piece of research I've ever seen on the psychoactive.
I've tried to get Trout on the show a bunch of times. I hope to do that soon.
He seems like a very private guy, but what a piece of research. Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Anyhow, to get back to my story, after I was released, and you know, something I was trying to make clear, they waited for my daughter to be there. There's no question about it. Drug busts don't happen at 11 in the morning. They happen usually at sunrise or in the middle of the night. You know, my arrest with 11 people coming in for a mailed package of cactus with machine guns with a child in the house. You know, there could have been a traffic stop. I could have been called downstairs to sign for the package. There were a number of options that could have happened. But instead they chose to wait for my daughter to be there and come in with machine guns. They could have come with a knock at the door. They could have called me and I would have walked over, you know, honestly.
And they were federal agents. They weren't.
There were 5 different agencies, and I live in Washington, D.C. So there is. I'm not going to name which agencies they were. Washington, D.C. has probably 20 or 30 different police agencies that could be involved.
Good grief!
But I will tell you one thing: I am incredibly cautious about taunting the police in any way. I do not want to, you know, I mean, this scared me to the point where I'm uncomfortable even naming which branches of police invaded my home for this illegal arrest. Um,
So
so
you're not yet feeling even remotely settled at this point, then?
no, I
Yeah.
mean, you know, well, because there's more to the story. Because then immediately what happened was that triggered my daughter's mother to file, custody proceedings with the assumption that I'm now some drug dealer who is creating a dangerous space for our child. And, I do want to say that, as far as my personal life and that goes, I'm hoping people out there can understand that a mother in that situation can, you know, I can understand that perspective at that time. And I don't want to go into the problems, that brought up
Sure.
too much, but that was a lengthy and extensive, very costly, uh,
Mm.
experience that ultimately, well, I mean, I thought it had ended, but it has not, and it's continuing to go on. And what this arrest has done, has put me in the situation where any advantage that I may have had as being an exemplar parent is completely erased and totally diminished because I have this arrest on my record. So the conversation in custody is starting with, let's talk about the arrests, not, hey, you took care of her for 10 days straight during COVID. Um,
Hmm.
and it has been a very difficult and very expensive, complication as a result of this arrest. Um, you know, uh, I argued with the prosecutor for a long time. This was during COVID, and the courthouses were shut down. And in Washington D.C., there's some very complicated rules that would have required my case to go before the grand jury, and there wasn't a grand jury, and things were. Anyhow, they offered me what's called a deferred prosecution agreement, which is a document that says an admission of guilt, basically, and then you do your community service, and then if you complete it at the end, they'll probably dismiss your case. Rather than, it's basically, if you're a good guy and you just go ahead and put your head down. And I said, I cannot sign this because I am not guilty. I did not do this, and you don't have any evidence, and I don't really even understand why I'm here. But I don't have any more money, so I'll sign this DPA if you remove the clause where I admit to any wrongdoing. And so they grumbled and gave me a sideways glance, but then they did that. And so I have a DPA in which I admitted absolutely nothing except that I would do community
Mm.
service. I did my community service, and my case was dismissed. Um, but part of the arrogance that I had going into this situation was through my activism, through all the work I had done, through all the people I knew in the psychedelic community, through all of us who I believed were like-minded people. It was just my assumption that there would be help, that there would be somebody out there, that there would be one of these organizations that can do something that would. And honestly, none of my calls got returned. Let me amend that. There are a lot of really good people who reached out. A lot of really good people. They just weren't the people who could help realistically. Emotionally, it was tremendous and I appreciate it. But as far as dealing with the case, here was I was an exemplar case. Here I was not selling drugs. The mushrooms that I did have were not an extensive amount, and I used them primarily for a patent that I was working on and have pretty much a documentation of where they have all gone. There's no ambiguity about, oh, well, you grew these mushrooms, where'd they all go? That's documented.
Was the arrest before I-81 went through or after?
The arrest happened after I-81 was passed, before it was enacted. Now,
Mm-hmm.
I have been told that there were 13 arrests, 13 federal arrests following the first 13 decriminalizations. That Cole was number one and I was number 13, and that there are, a bunch in between that just never were in the press, that just never wanted to
Mm-hmm.
talk about it. You know, I did reach out, and I had a few people reach out. There's a Psychedelic Justice League, which is a really well-intended organization. They don't have any money to do anything, and there's no unity. There's no unity in the psychedelic community whatsoever. And I was absolutely astonished when I reached out to people who are fairly big names in the movement, who I know personally. Here I was, a guy who was, for personal use and personal growth, a member of a religious organization, having custody threatened for an illegal arrest of legal psychedelics. I was the perfect case, and
Yeah.
willing, and already publicly psychedelic. I had no reputation to trash. I was willing to take this public and go to trial. And everybody who could have been in the position to say, let's do this and let's pick this fight. So take the deal, man. Sorry, I can't help.
That's ridiculous.
And that was astonishing for me.
What is your supposition? Like, why was there such little support?
I think ultimately, at the end of the day, there's a lot of morality that surrounds, the way people use drugs. And I think it's difficult for people to sort of talk about it, but the morality of inebriation it's sort of like racism in dating. It's like, it's a weird thing to talk about, because, like, is your preference racist, or is it, so there's a morality with psychedelics that seems to, in some people's minds, supersede. Some people think psychedelics are okay where cocaine isn't, and then there are the people who think, well, you should have waited until to go ahead and get busted now before it's enacted was a stupid thing to do. It had passed, you had worked on it, and that hurts
Like,
the
they're
cause.
talking about it like it's like as if you were selling and buying massive amounts of mushrooms online. Like, that's kind of weird to me.
I mean, I can only make assumptions about what people thought, honestly.
Yeah.
But my feeling was that the attitude I seemed to get was, you were selling drugs, dude. What do you want? And I wasn't. I never was. I mean, honestly, if you grow mushrooms, you will make more money selling legal mushrooms than you will selling illegal mushrooms every day of the week.
Yeah. And I've said this on the show a number of times. Recently, the Canadian illegal psilocybin market collapsed to the point where you could buy a garbage bag, like 50-gallon bag full of mushrooms for $1 or free. So, like, there is not much. You're right. There's not much money in mushrooms.
I can grow a little jar of cordyceps like this that I can sell for $100, and the same
Yeah.
amount of time and effort to put into psilocybin is $10. There's nothing about selling mushrooms that is worth it. I was, sort of going back to the help situation. The thing that surprised me the most is the decriminalized movement. And I'm not talking specifically about the local, there's a lot of chapters of decriminalized, and they're all very different. And then there's the national chapter of decriminalized, which is also different.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody leaned in. Nobody sort of even asked to pick up the story, really.
So you're kind of like, my sense is like folks are really encouraged to break the law in a lot of these cases. And if there's no like plan for support, that's a little edgy.
Well, I think that, first of all, I want to be very clear. I very actively support decriminalization of drugs. I support decriminalization of all drugs. And I will, argue and fight about that to the very end. The organization and the style of things that are happening with the decrim movement has some very fundamental problems that aren't talked about. And, going to your point a little bit, the thing that bothers me the most about the decrim movement and that is the grow, gather, give model, which sounds great, and it sounds very community based. But the truth is, the grower, the gatherer, and the giver are one person. Everyone else is taking. And that's a very risky person to be, as I found out. And, the grow, gather, give is, I know how to find safe mushrooms to eat. Do you? I know how to grow mushrooms. Do you? So I can gather and I can grow and I can have them to give, but I don't know anybody else locally that is in my position. So that isn't really a viable solution. And I think that there's this idea that we're all going to get together and do this thing, but once you follow the ideas out more logically, they don't really seem to carry water. They get enthusiasm, and it has been a great movement to get cities involved, and cities all seem to break off and find their own adaptation. And I'm not being critical of that. I think that that is awesome, and I will take every step of progress that we can get. But there isn't the support structure there. There isn't the next step. There isn't what happens if I move forward with you and fall down.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't have a solution for it. I wish that I did. I think that that it's I've heard a lot of discussion about how are we going to find enough practitioners and how are we going to figure out who's going to get to charge people to sit with psychedelics and who's going to officially get to be experts. But I haven't heard anybody saying, who are we going to help? How are we going to help the people that have been arrested? And there are a lot that have been arrested.
So one of my biggest criticisms, and from what I understand, there's attempts to fix this, is it's the psychedelic decrim movement's a little bit racist and a little bit tone deaf. For instance, like I'm on your side a bit here around, like, I go further. I say like all drug legalization and safe supply, because we had 9 people in 9 days die in my town from fentanyl.
I'm with you 100% there.
Decrim's a baby step. It's not ideal by any stretch, but it's an incremental improvement. But how many black people really get arrested for mushrooms, or any plant psychedelic? When how many get arrested for life for cannabis, for instance, or like other substances that are more culturally.
As I sat in the jail cell that I sat in as the only white person in the row, it was all I could think about. I mean, after worrying about my child, I wasn't really worried that I was going to be staying in jail. I knew I was getting out of jail, and I knew I had the money to hire a lawyer, and I knew that I had a chance to walk away from this pretty much unscathed. I knew that. And financially, I got hurt really badly. And emotionally, I've been devastated. But, as far as being hurt from this, I pretty much walked away unscathed. And I knew that from the minute I was arrested. And as I sat and I looked around at the other gentlemen up and down the rows who were probably in there for anything as stupid as I was, and I knew that they weren't getting out. I knew it. I knew it. I knew it. And I don't think anybody has any idea what being arrested is until you have been arrested. It is, I mean, I get emotional just thinking about it. It's incredibly traumatic. You can think, oh, yeah, I can deal with that. And, maybe if what happened is you got arrested at a DUI stop and, it's just a big hassle and you're fine. That's one thing. But whatever you think your reaction is going to be when 11 SWAT guys bust in your door, you have absolutely no idea. It is terrifying. I mean,
like they literally could kill you and get away with it. We've seen it plenty of times. And, the way they executed it in your case is so horrible because they literally traumatized an old woman and a young child. Like,
my mom might hear this, so we're not going to call her an old woman, an older woman, very youthful older woman. But
good.
But yeah, I mean, like I said, they could have lured us. They could have. There's so many ways they could have done. They could have just sent one uniformed guy to knock on the door. I mean, there's any number of ways this could have been handled, and they didn't. But I'm sort of lost as to where we were on the track, and I don't want to.
Oh, that's all right. So, like, I was kind of expressing my safe supply one what we have coming, and this is kind of novel and not necessarily on topic, but William Leonard Picard, who just got out of doing 20 years in prison for LSD manufacture, he predicts hundreds of thousands of novel substances showing up in the next 5-10 years, and we're not ready. The decrim thing is too little too late.
Yeah, no, I
Seeing...
listened to that episode.
Cool.
He's a fascinating guy.
Lovely character.
Yeah, I just I, just to sort of talk about him for 1 second. I think hearing him talk and his tranquility and the place he got to with psychedelics and his discussion about how he doesn't use them anymore because he got to where he wanted to be, I don't think I've ever heard anyone really say that message, particularly not somebody as involved. And I just found it to be a really sort of incredible statement on his part. But as far as the novel substances go, there's if you pay attention to what's happening in the psychedelic world, there's a company, which I'm not going to name, which already has an AI machine that is exploring every single tryptamine molecular combination possible and then patenting them.
Mm-hmm.
So they are presenting it as, look at this amazing thing we're doing, where we're presenting we're doing this research for you, and then anytime you want, you can just buy our license and it's already made for you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm very troubled by that idea. And if you
flip it to the inverse of like the black market, because like when the black market people with low morality start doing this, we're going to see a flooded black market, and there might even be cheaper compounds that fool reagent tests that are definitely going to hurt people coming up. And
my personal opinion, if we're going to go down this road and talk about this stuff, is I think that when you look particularly at the psychedelic stock market, I think all of these companies that are banking on making the next novel compound are going to go out of business. I think whatever they make is going to be manufactured in 55-gallon drums in China and sent over in boatloads for a nickel a piece. And I think that if we treat psychedelics,
this is like black market competing with above ground market, right? This is like, it's a weird discussion, but it's an important one.
I think it's an important one because it's talked about like it's sort of an A-B black and white type of situation, but it's not. It doesn't have to be that way. If you look at, for example, food, people who produce food have their own market. And I can go ahead and buy all the ingredients for not very much money and make my own food. But if I want, specialty food, I go someplace where there are specialists who know how to assemble these things and create an experience. And if I'm looking at the psychedelic companies that are out there, I think a company like Field Trip, where they're putting together clinics and they're actually doing things, is a company that I think is doing some interesting stuff. But when you look at some of the other ones, and I don't want to say any names of things that I'm negatively speaking about, but there are lots of ones that just have these crazy ideas and they want to patent.
Well, it's called just like pure biotech versus like a more clinical thing. Like the biotech is always going to be super duper risky, right? And even if you get it to market, it doesn't necessarily mean that physicians are going to prescribe. So it's like a really complicated thing. Like my guess is that far greater than half of these companies are going to go away and or just get acquired for their IP. But really, like this is tough business territory. Like I don't want to be in that business. It seems too high risk for me.
Well, I will tell you what. After I had the arrest, I even to this day, I am extremely hesitant to get around anything that might be an illegal substance. I just don't feel that things are clear enough for me to take those kind of risks. So I absolutely don't. But, the trauma, I think something that you learn when you work with psychedelics and people and healing is that trauma is not a memory in your mind. Trauma is a memory in your whole body. Is that you grind your teeth when you're stressed. People have a physical reaction. I had a very physical reaction to the arrest where, it was tension. It was, the fight or flight had kicked in and wouldn't kick off. And that is exactly what psychedelic therapy is, being touted as the solution for, but now it was completely inaccessible to me. So I made the decision to try ketamine, going to ketamine therapy. And I found the experiences to be amazing. Loved it. I did not find. I went to a legal clinic with doctor supervision and did the intravenous. I did 3 separate 1-hour sessions, and it was a lovely experience, and I felt better for the day. I didn't find really the lasting sort of
Not
experiential.
paired with therapy.
I had been seeing a therapist at the time. I wasn't doing it as combined therapy, but at that time I was seeing a therapist. I mean, when you get arrested, if you have the capacity, if you have the ability to talk it through with somebody, I strongly encourage people to at least do it a little bit. So, but from I sat down and I spoke with the doctor about the ketamine therapy, and he was really interested because he was pretty new to the profession and had sort of nobody in the clinic had ever tried ketamine.
That's
You know,
crazy.
and I think he must have been like an ophthalmologist before and had the licensing and could switch over, and this seemed like the thing to do. And I was talking to him, and what they do with ketamine therapy is, excuse me a second,
All good. All good.
they step up dosages. So what they'll do is on your first dosage, they'll give you a, you know, X. On your second visit, they'll give you X plus 1. On your third, X plus 2. And on your fourth, when you've been acclimated, they give you like 2X. So that's sort of the last treatment. And in speaking with the doctor, I said to him, I'm pretty psychedelic familiar. Could we just skip to the last treatment dosage because, that's where the therapy happens? And he looked at me completely puzzled and said, well, what are you talking about?
Oh
Like,
my God.
and I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, the way we treat this is as a cumulative effect of the chemicals, that there is a chemical reaction that has a cumulative effect that needs to be stepped up in order to be effective. And it is the long-term exposure to these chemicals and the chemical changes that affect the long-term mood. And my jaw hit the floor. I said, you can't possibly. I mean, the experience is where you learn and where you grow. There may be a chemical aspect to it. I have no scientific understanding of that element at all. But for me, I have very much found growth in the experience itself. And he said to me, and I quote, we view the experience as a side effect.
And that's typical of psychiatry and generally.
So
Human experience is a epiphenomenon of, and largely kind of not exactly important or focused on.
But the experience of going into the clinic and having a psychedelic experience at 11 o'clock in the morning that was over at 12, as sort of a therapeutic, it was interesting. It was not something I would say, hey, you got to do it. It works wonders. You know what I mean? Like, even as a psychedelic advocate, even as somebody who, I wanted nothing more than to walk out of there saying, fixed. I am done. This is perfect.
This is a really common critique of most of these ketamine IV facilities. It's largely, spun up by anesthesiologists with minimal understanding of this whole psychedelic world, and definitely not really a good understanding of psychiatry or the state of psychiatry currently. So,
well,
the doctor and I paired with,
the doctor and I were having this conversation, and I said, well, I mean, do you not take into account the spiritual aspect at all? And he said, well, we really rely on science. And I said, well, the science says people with spirituality are happier. So, I'm not asking you to confirm God. I'm just, asking you to acknowledge that, that that aspect is a really important part of it, and spirituality may mean to somebody, your relationship with, your God. Spirituality to me personally means a lot more of, you know, the bigger picture of the whole world, including nature. It's sort of where I'm at with that. And for other
Hmm.
people, it's something completely different. But everybody has their level, and to deny that's an aspect of human life, like I said, I'm not trying to prove a philosophy. I have no dog in that fight. Um, but people have a
Yeah.
belief system. Everybody has a belief system, and it's based in something, whether it's the financial system or, I mean, there's a lot of systems people just believe in, and it has a very big effect. I think
Hmm.
that this idea of compartmentalizing physical and mental and emotional is very problematic, but it's sort of the root of
Yeah, it's a little immature.
that's
Um,
where medicine is.
so how do you? So highly disappointed with IV
No,
ketamine in series.
not highly disappointed. I really enjoyed it. The experiences were pleasurable,
I meant the durability of the
but the
results. Yeah, it's like
durability,
it's an interesting time.
right? The durability, I would do it again, but I would not
Hmm.
expect long-term results. You know, but I think that it's a
Um,
really, I
mhm.
mean, as far as if we can step away from the spirit, the therapeutic and all of that on the major therapeutic. And do I think it is a lovely option for when you're having a shitty day to pop down to the ketamine clinic and, maybe once a year or twice a year, have an infusion and drift off? I think that would be a lovely option to have. I don't think it's going to cure my depression, if I,
Hmm.
but, with mushrooms, I have sat with a lot of people who have had incredible disappointments, with mushrooms. I've seen
Hmm.
amazing things, and that's why I'm still here. But I have seen people who have had amazing experiences and then were crushed that they would never feel that joy ever again. And I've seen people have horrifying experiences. One person said the only thing I learned was that I can survive a bad trip. you know, I think that we're all trying to find our reality, and I think it goes all the way back to safe access,
Hmm.
you know, and legality and
Right. Because like diversion is not really prevented. Well, I guess diversion from a safe supply is a bit prevented by all these strict rules, but people are going to buy from anywhere and get into unsafe situations. So I think these at home ketamine services and other kind of like ketamine assisted psychotherapy protocols are pretty good and helpful. But you have to figure out if people have to try things, right? In order to find out what works for them as an individual. Not everybody's going to respond the same to this stuff.
I am a really, really huge admirer and big fan of Dr. Carl Hart, you
Same.
know, and when you read his book, at least for me, it made me feel like he just said all my ideas. I give him full credit for him being an absolute, I mean, having been through the arrest I've been through, I had no real understanding of how brave and how heroic what he has done is, and I will endlessly admire the strength and courage it took to be the person that he is and to stand up for what he's standing up for. But one of the things that he really talks about is this idea that we have to stop with the narrative that, like with diversion and all that. Not everyone using drugs needs therapy or has a problem. Most people don't. The idea, oh, he got arrested for drugs, well, let's send him to rehab instead of jail. Well, that's probably just wasting everybody's time. I mean,
Right. Right. Like I love the Portugal model, but it still can be improved, right? Like you get busted with some substance and you maybe it's decriminalized there, everything. So you have to go in front of a little tribunal if you have too much in your possession. And you get to say like yes or no, I want treatment. And I think that's it. And they give you a little bit of harm reduction education and you're on your way.
I will say, having been to Portugal,
Mm-hmm.
like an idiot American tourist, I'm very well traveled, and I don't usually do the idiot American tourist thing. But in Portugal, being aware of the laws, I sort of went hunting around the city to see how it manifested. And for the most part, drug use is incredibly frowned upon there. There are you can see addicts living in the street, but there's no head shops. There's no like, oh, we're decriminalized and let's sell drugs now. I
What's a
literally,
staunchly Catholic culture?
I literally can find drugs probably any place in the world, and I couldn't find them there.
Right, and those laws went into place in response to a really serious opioid epidemic and AIDS epidemic, far worse than we have today in the United States. As far as I understand, and proportionally too. Like they're a small country, we're third largest by population in the world, so it's going to be different. But poor Catholic country, and it seems to have worked really well to turn around their figures. Yeah.
No, it's definitely a model that I think is great. It's you know I remember the numbers were astronomical as far as the addiction rate, and that I couldn't say an exact number, but that it drastically cut that. And again, coming back to this thing I'm harping on, this morality issue, which is everyone's talked about the racism that is behind the drug laws. And I could talk about that endlessly because it is a huge, 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 huge issue. But there are other things behind the drug laws, like industry. If I sell you a bag of weed, there's a good chance you're gonna have that weed for a little while. You can drink your paycheck on a Friday night.
Totally.
And then you'll have to be sober until the next Friday. So you'll show up to work because you're broke. There's a lot of things that go into how morality happened. I always look to online. There's all these people that will post this thing about this shopping cart. Like, I judge people on whether they return their shopping carts to like, if you're just an average person, take the time and return the shopping cart and be a decent human. Well, that used to be somebody's job. That used to be a job of people who had just gotten out of prison, who had mental disabilities, who are members of the community. Going around and collecting the shopping carts was a great way to provide employment to basically unemployable people who the community wanted to see helped. And stores have cut that out entirely, and it has now become a moral issue that you better return your cart, otherwise you're a jerk. So that took 10 years before the job disappeared and you became a morally ostracized for not doing this person's job. So morality can change very quickly. And I think that, the morality around inebriation, people are staying at home a lot more. They are seeing the merits in maybe, catching a buzz to do this, or taking a break in the middle of the day, or understanding that they can accomplish all of their work and all of their obligations and all of their responsibilities while using responsibly, and just don't want to deal with the hassle of, and I think what we're seeing, at least in the psychedelic world, is we're seeing that morality shift. And, the question I have in my mind is, how are we going to get that to happen with all the other drugs? Because if we can get that tidal wave happening
I like to start with like the racist origins of the drug war. And, like, I assume you read, there's some issues with this author, Johann Hari's Chasing the Scream, kind of giving a pretty nice,
I don't know.
Oh my goodness.
Now I have something
incredible. So he was just kind of like one of these early prohibition guys going after people selling alcohol, right? And I think he was well married and to like a higher echelon of people. And as soon as prohibition ended, these guys needed jobs, and they spun up the DEA, or the precursor to the DEA. Again with racist and gnarly ends in mind. And Anslinger was his name. And
Anslinger, I know who he is.
Yeah, a horrible individual. And the book highlights how horrible and hurt this person is, and died a heroin user. Even though he was prosecuting and putting people in jail for heroin and other substances for so long. Like, if we tell the story, the history really well, kind of how Carl Hart does and Hari does, we can change hearts and minds quickly. I shifted some big money attorneys' perspective on the drug war in a 3-minute, maybe probably 2-minute conversation. from these things should always be illegal to, oh, I guess I should learn more, and maybe you're right. Like we
I
can
would
do
have to
that.
say that I'm glad you changed his mind in the bar, but with your show out, I am so grateful for the work that you're doing and
Thank you.
having this discussion out here in the public. And it's an incredibly brave thing that you're doing as well. I mean, I spoke of, to be public about something illegal. Um, it, it, there is a risk absolutely associated with it.
Yeah. Like
And
I haven't been able to grow mushrooms in 6 7 years. It sucks. And like I'm sure I could grow gourmet medicinal, but as evidenced by your situation, it might not matter if it's
right,
lion's mane.
I'm not growing anything, but I will tell you that a certain 3-letter enforcement agency uh, gave me back my spores.
That's nice.
Yeah,
It's a start.
pretty clearly labeled. There's no ambiguity, but I've not grown since. And I won't. But with the racism and the drug war, it's such a double-edged sword. It's sort of what you had been mentioning earlier, which is that if you are going to call people out to take the risk, you need to be there to support them when there's trouble, and to look at the Black community and how many times they've been told, you help us over the fence and we're going to reach back and pull you with us, or you go do that and we'll have your back. And Black people using drugs get shot. And it is very hard to say to the Black community, we need you to come out and be public with this. And, I think if we look at the stoned ape theory, which I hear people talk about all the time, and this idea that people in Africa developed
Yeah.
using mushrooms, and that
I
these
love
mushrooms
talking
are
about it.
all over Africa. Well, if you take it further, did they stop, or did they say, "Hey, we got here, we're just going to stop taking these mushrooms," or were they part of ritual from then all the way forward? Then, if we take that thought forward, when people were captured, enslaved, and dragged to the United States, when those enslaved people were put in the American South with fields filled with cattle, and these mushrooms were growing, there must have been people there who knew what were in those mushrooms. But there is no written record I've ever been able to find of enslaved people from that period having any use of Jimson weed is the only psychedelic I was able to find. But I find it very difficult to believe that in time when these people were captured and being starved, that nobody tried eating one of these mushrooms. I mean, so as far as the racist history of the
And there
drug
are
laws,
plenty of African plant medicine traditions, plenty, and they came over. They've just been really secretive.
and if those traditions are out there, and if by being kept secretive they've been able to be kept alive, I don't know that calling for them to be shared is the thing to do. I don't know how the whole complicated thing works, but
I'm okay with people having secrets and secret
yeah.
societies. Like what I'm not okay with is taxpayer dollars going to put people in prison for the rest of their lives for nonviolent offenses and have this like trickle down for generations of harm. And like, I think it's absolutely unconscionable that our dollars go towards this, enslaving our fellow man.
I am 100% in agreement, and that's
Yeah.
why I don't know how to ask members of the Black community to take that risk, because that risk for
I
them
don't know that we should.
is
Right? Like, let's get loud as we can. Well,
I, I'm
you did your service.
and I will keep yelling about it. I'm going to do my best not
Mm-hmm.
to get arrested, but I think we all have to. But at the end of the day, I cannot think of a single time when
Mm-hmm.
when white folks just decided to make it easier for the Black folks. I just have never seen that happen. You know,
Mm-hmm.
in this country, progress for the Black community comes with a very, very heavy price, and it always has. And I want to see that changed. But the tone of our country right now is not giving me a lot of hope that, you know, that
Mm-hmm.
there's a safe path forward right now. So I mean, I'm vexed by it constantly. In Washington
Mm-hmm.
D.C., we're 50% black, and it's you know I'm not talking about an abstraction. I'm talking about my friends and my neighbors, and I want them safe. You know.
Right. Like it's a big city, but it's not New York. It's like neighborhoods and like it's a really tough situation in Washington D.C. And how do we improve that situation? It's advocacy, education. I was trying to merge those two words for a moment there. It was fun. And how do we just keep going? And we have to keep learning too. Go ahead.
I will say one thing that I think the psychedelic community needs. I would love to see, which is, there is so much segregation that happens without intent necessarily. We put out the ad, these are the people that applied. I can't help it if it didn't have any women. I can't help it if it didn't have any black people. I can't, this was the pool I was given, and it just happens to be this job has only been applied to by white guys. And that absolutely happens. That really does happen. As the psychedelic community, if we are going to actively be inclusive, we need to understand that we need to advertise someplace else. It doesn't mean no women want the job. It doesn't mean no black people want the job. It means they are not seeing those ads. So if the only people who are applying are white Republicans, then you are clearly advertising your job in a place that has an abundance of white Republicans. You know, there needs to be a concerted effort to reach diverse hires.
Mm-hmm.
You know, otherwise, what happened in every other business will happen in this one. Look, we put up the sign. This is who applied. And now with the algorithms that happen with job hiring platforms and all that, there is a big hiring wave coming, and there are a lot of people in the African American community that could greatly benefit from some of the promise that psychedelics have, but they're going to benefit greatly, considerably more greatly, if they can have support from members of their community.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that whole idea of set and setting.
Totally.
Um, you know, it, you know that I am not going to be able to afford a woman traumatized by racial violence the comfort level that she really deserves to work through a trauma. You know, so I think as a psychedelic community, I would love to see an active effort to really reach out to different communities. And I think that you know one place that I'm amazed in the psychedelic community is the left and the right kind of come together here, right? The veterans and the cops want to see PTSD ended, and the hippies and the weirdos want to see the PTSD ended, and people are tired of seeing people in jail. So I think that there is some interesting politics that could happen, but I don't, did I solve the world
Mm-hmm.
yet?
I think you nailed it. So I guess, can you give just again a little bit of a word of caution for people in
Right. That's
this kind of psychedelic activism space?
right. That's very much what I had initially wanted to talk about, and what I will absolutely tell you is, um, the story I was told was that it came through customs. Um, the customs agent who opened it knew that that much peyote could have only meant gang activity, so the wild peyote gangs, and that's why they had to send the SWAT team, and that apparently is the story. Now, my personal belief is that they were in my email, and when the tracking number from Shaman Dealer or whatever the place was called saying your delivery is coming showed up in my email, they intercepted it and said, we got him. We got him. This shaman thing, we're going to get him. And they intercepted the package and did the bust. And I will tell you, I don't care what you think. They know everything. They are paying attention to everything. They have seen all of your Facebook posts. They have seen all of your Reddit posts. If you are posting about drug use, they already know who you are. I'm going to tell you, they knew more than I ever imagined that they would know. They know everything. There is no privacy. Once they have decided you are a subject of interest, everything is in the open. That's it. It's done. And it's in the open basically forever. I mean, you never
Do
know.
you think there's any hope of digital security or privacy for activists? No.
No.
Even with like hyper encrypted tools?
I mean, I think that if you make it your full-time job to hide communication from the government, then you could probably do it for a while, but it's, to what end? So, at this point, my house is devoid of illegal anything. My house is devoid of anything that might be mistaken for anything, because that's another thing. That's another thing that I really wanted to bring up with Cole and with the psychedelic churches and all of the decrim stuff. You are relying on people who think marijuana kills people.
Oh, God.
To understand the difference between San Pedro and peyote. You are relying on people who, well, I've met some very bright cops, and I've met some cops who, could definitely use some better education. But you're depending on not just the police, but the prosecutor and the judge having an understanding and being okay with a religious psychedelic institution. So you may have all the protections on paper, but you do not actually have any protection. And if your church doesn't come to your side and you don't have proof that you actually pray to a psychedelic god somehow, then you do not have a religious defense, no matter what you think.
Yeah, I'm a little dubious of these religious defenses. Like a lot of people are getting inspired to start groups, and I know people who have been arrested as part of those. I know we did a whole series, Seth, on what would it take to get a safe religion through, like a whole free course series talking to a ton of attorneys, and long and short, it takes at least $1 million, and your willingness to confess all sorts of crimes to the DEA, with a hope that you might get approved.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy. And then meanwhile, Home Depot continues to sell epic amounts of mescaline with
the world's largest mescaline dealer.
Easily the world's largest mescaline dealer. I mean, by the metric ton.
Well,
but yeah, I think
that buy some plants later.
That whatever you think as far as your protection, it's probably not nearly enough. And if you are not prepared to deal with law enforcement, do not post anything on social media. Just, figure out a way to keep your name out of it. Just, I mean, at this point for me, I'm out. I've been through it. There's no surprises. And, I'm very fortunate that when I was arrested, my job was me, and I wasn't going to get fired for a drug arrest, and my whole family already knew because I'd been an activist. But for people who have very good reasons for keeping their life private, it's a very difficult thing to have happen. And the trauma is lasting, and it's definitely affected employment and my finances, and it's affected my daughter's mental well-being. And she's in therapy and has been since the beginning, and we have very much made sure that that trauma has been something we've addressed, and I won't say fixed, but it's something that we are very active in dealing with. And then the other side to it is that if they come in and they do this, and I mean, they didn't find any drugs in my house. They didn't find any money. They didn't find any evidence of anything. And almost everything they took got returned. The only
Mm.
stuff that they kept were some mushrooms that I had grown, which actually were used in a Washington Post article. A photographer came and photographed all my mushrooms, and they're used constantly because there's some of the ones that are used in the Getty images. And so
Oh
my
my
mushrooms that were
goodness.
confiscated by the DEA are in like everybody's website.
Oh my gosh. Did
But
you,
go ahead.
maybe off base here, like were there charges around mushrooms against you at
Nope.
all? It's
No, they
incredible.
took my grows and they took my mushrooms. There was no mention of mushrooms in any of the charges.
Like to me it's kind of like an intimidation approach. Like let me intimidate you. Like Cole Cole had some penalties, but it could have been a lot worse. Um and I don't really understand what the tactic is here other than to make people afraid of the government.
Well, I mean,
Um
like I said, I posted a lot of things online, including there is a police station near my home where this time of year, tremendous amount of psychedelic mushrooms grow. And I posted a picture of mushrooms I had found with 3 squad cars in the background on my Facebook, which some have suggested may have been the step too far. I think there are probably many steps too far, and that
mhm.
did not help. But you know, if you're going to be that arrogant, be prepared for a knock on your door. And like I said, the thing that is the most difficult is it doesn't matter what the law is. It really doesn't. It matters what people understand. And finding people who understand the difference between heroin and magic mushrooms is a lot harder than you think.
It's surprising, man. I Yeah, we could keep going for hours, unfortunately, and fortunately. Um, but I'm really grateful that you reached out because this is something that's really close to my heart, and I think people are being a bit too bold in the types of activities they do, both in person and online, and it's scary to me. I don't want to lose more kind of soldiers in this fight. It's really scary to me.
You're
It
allowed to
can't
say
happen.
lots of things. Just don't put pictures up. Just don't say, you know, if it's illegal, just it doesn't need to be up. If you're in a
Hmm.
decriminalized area, you're still taking risks at a federal level, and
Hmm.
and they know everything. I don't mean like they knew like a couple of, no, everything. They knew everything.
Like even contents of email kind of stuff.
They took 2 of my computers. They took my phone. They had clearly been in my emails. Um,
Hmm.
I mean, what are you going to do? They take your computer. What are you going to do if they go ahead and they put a file in? You know, I, I,
Hmm.
I don't know how to deal with that. As they put a
Yeah.
file in that you don't find out until they arrest you 6 months later for,
Right.
the nuclear secrets in your computer.
Uh,
Or
really, everybody
whatever.
needs to be just super careful. That's kind of the long and short here. Like, even if you're careful at home, once they confiscate your stuff, like the digital forensics and the spyware they have, or next generation stuff you don't even know about yet. So just be wildly careful. You know, try your best to, I don't know, be a little bit more paranoid. I know you think the spirit's protecting you, and perhaps it is, but you know, there's there's a lot of energy over at the FBI, DEA, etc., that can come crashing down on you in a really uncomfortable and harmful way. So just be safe out there, everybody. That's kind of it. Like I'm hot on this digital security thing. Um, I hope you, after hearing this, everybody is a little bit more curious how to do encryption really well, how to understand where things can be spied on. I don't know if you recall, like there were some NSA leaks about like spyware, and maybe they don't have total control of your phone, but they can see what's going on the screen sometimes. Um, and I don't know that every agency has that, but I think a lot of agencies do.
Oh,
Um,
Pegasus is the name of an old program that I know about. That's how old the program
mhm.
is. That they can send via a text that you don't even have to open, and then they have complete control of your phone. And that's that. It's done.
Yeah. And this is like, if we look at the black market of hackers, this is a whole industry. Hackers finding exploits and selling them to the highest bidder online. Exploits being ways of getting control of digital devices and various systems online. So, it's a whole economy in and of itself that's not talked about much. Intelligence agencies probably buy this stuff up. It's a competitive game. So, we just got to be really safe to the best of our abilities, everybody. And, tell your friends, don't text, SMS, ridiculous things about drugs. I had to educate really smart people very recently about encryption. It blows my mind that I had to. But anyway, I guess let's wrap here. Do you have a website or anything you want to point people to?
I don't. I'm not exactly sure at this moment what the status of District Psychedelic is. I sort of let that districtpsychedelic.com is my sort of website. But since the arrest, I've been not maintaining it as much, but I probably will. But you can find me easiest on LinkedIn generally at District Psychedelic.
Okay. Perfect.
And thank you so much for having me. And I cannot tell you how much I appreciate the work that you do, and the diversity of your topics and the broad coverage of this industry is, I think, one of the biggest helps that we have going now. So thank you very much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
No, you're welcome. Seth Rosenberg, thanks for being here. Really appreciate it, and can't wait to do more.